and welcome to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Scharf's real-world advice for well-intentioned humans, a show for anyone who has shared life, love, and intimacy. Today's episode, How to Tell Your Children About Your Divorce, Doing Well with the Scariest Conversation of Your Life. I'm your co-host, Jane Prelinger. Your host is Kate Scharf. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Jane.
Kate, I think the idea of having the conversation is something that really keeps parents up at night. They're terrified that the divorce will cause their children pain, and they can't imagine how they're going to deliver the news. I certainly remember struggling with that. At the same time, we also know that kids really need information about what's happening in their families, even the upsetting stuff, so that they can understand and adjust. And perhaps most important, not think that there's something wrong with them. But when we were preparing for this show, you told me an interesting and kind of upsetting statistic. Apparently, there's been some research over the past 5 years that the average American family spends less than 10 minutes total talking to their kids about the changes in the family.
Yeah, that's right. It's a kind of a shocking piece of information, but it's true. As I've been thinking about it in preparation for today, I realize it's not that surprising, right? I mean, as you were saying, this is, for many people, the scariest conversation they have ever had to have.
Yeah.
You know, I've used this analogy before, but if you think about when your child was a baby and how hard it was just to take them to the pediatrician knowing they were going to have like a needle stick and feeling like a horrible person, like you were delivering your child into this.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So if that's hard... Yeah. The idea of sitting them down and saying, hey, kids, like, we're about to ruin your entire life, or feel like that's the conversation you're having. Yeah. Nobody wants to do that, and especially not the parent who doesn't want divorce, right?
Oh, yeah. So
it actually isn't that surprising when you consider what we're asking of ourselves in having this conversation, that people avoid it. And I think also the statistic really refers to the idea of sitting down with kids and having, you know, a planned conversation. People really typically don't do that.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, but it doesn't mean that there's never any discussion about the fact that there are two homes, or I think it really is referring to the idea of having a thoughtful,
intentional, planned, co-created. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I also think that there are some ideas that many of us have about having conversations about upsetting things that are not specific to divorce, that are just prevalent, that get in the way of having the conversation. And there's sort of ideas like what you don't talk about is less upsetting than what you do talk about. In other words, if you lean into or bring up something upsetting, you might create a sense that this is something to be upset about.
When actually, would it be fair to say the opposite seems to be true?
I think so. I think that divorce is upsetting. And if you don't name it as such, it's a sort of a form of gaslighting. I think that it's really, when it comes to something like divorce, like a death, like a situation that you know is happening in your child's life, where the right feeling would be upset or fear or something, if they're being bullied at school or they're not doing as well in school as they could. All of these things suggest that there should be a conversation, but there's a lot of worry that the conversation is what's going to put the idea. Yeah. Sometimes parents don't have the conversation about divorce because they can't agree on what to say or on why it's happening. You know, it might be just what words to say, but it may also be the actual message. Basically, I just think most of us have no idea what to say, how to say it, when to say it, and we're just terrified.
So what do you think is the most important thing here then?
Well, I think the most important sort of umbrella thing to be thinking about as we move into the tip list is the idea that parents, when possible, should sit down together in advance of talking to their kids and strategize, essentially, about a whole number of things that we're about to get into, and make notes. I mean, if necessary, write yourselves a script or a set of bullet points that you can have and look over. I really don't think you should bring the notes into the talk, but it's very helpful to people to sometimes really have a kind of a crib sheet. And one thing to think about is, do we need help in developing this plan? And should we see a mental health person with expertise in this area to help us figure out what we're going to say?
Okay, so this leads right into our 10 tips today. We have about 10 for parents who are actually trying to put together that plan.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dive in with this, beginning with number 1. Work out as many details as you can in advance.
Right. So we actually have some upcoming episodes where we're going to talk in detail about what a divorce plan or custody agreement looks like and all the components of that. And we're going to bring in my colleague and co-author Lisa Herrick to join us in that discussion. So we're looking forward to that. So I'm not really talking about, this is all of the things that we have begun to talk about the divorce. I'm really talking specifically about, this is, for now anyway, as much information as we have about what is going to change in your life and what is not going to change in your life. And this is really the concrete stuff primarily. So one of us is going to stay here. One of us is going to go to an apartment. We have an apartment. We don't yet have an apartment. This is what we know about how we're going to share time with you, or this is who's helping us work it out. You're going to be able to go to the same school. You're going to have the same friends. You can play on the same soccer team. As much of that as you know.
And as much of that as it sounds, obviously, is developmentally appropriate for the kid.
That's right. And that's a theme that's going to go through our whole show today. But what kids want to know is not so much the why. And this is what surprises parents a lot. And I think what keeps people from talking about it is the fear of getting kind of emotionally laden questions, like, why are you getting divorced? And you may get some, and we'll talk about that. But kids of all ages, the first thing they want to know is, what does this mean for me?
For me.
Right. And sometimes you'll get, with young kids, very basic questions like, what will I eat? Like, will I be able to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwich in both places?
Yes.
And that seems like a simple question, but really what's underneath it is, am I going to be safe? I know you guys sometimes don't agree about things. Is there going to be continuity? The more complex parts of those questions, there will be time to answer over time. But in the beginning, they just really want to know, yes, there's going to be food you like in both places.
Well, that sort of brings us into our second tip, which I think is very important and a bit problematic, which is tip number 2, prepare a shared narrative. Now, that implies the parents can agree on a shared narrative.
Right. Yeah, that can be a sticky wicket. Not always, but very often. A shared narrative is... I'm sure other people use that phrase. It's a phrase I borrowed from an early supervisor who played with children and was talking about the importance of, in making a relationship with children, developing a story together about that child's life. And then she called it a shared narrative. A shared narrative is a story about how you came to be here as a couple that you can share with your kids. Again, as you point out, in a way that's appropriate for their age and developmental stage, their ability to process information. So with young kids, it's very simple. With older kids, simple, but, at a higher level.
Yes.
That explains why you're not going to be married anymore. The challenge is that I think there's always some difference in how parents view why they are where they are, especially if it's early in the process. Sometimes it's a really big delta, Sometimes it's because of infidelity. One person really wants to stay married, the other person really doesn't. It's always best, I think, if you can get on the same page or close to the same page, a united front. We all know that's the gold standard in co-parenting and divorce. It's not always possible.
Right.
And I think if you think about it as, okay, there's your narrative kind of on one side. There's your future ex's narrative on the other side. And in the Venn diagram, where's the overlap?
Yeah, that's a great point.
So if one person's narrative is, our marriage hasn't been good for a really long time. I had an affair. It was a destructive way out, but I think it was a symptom. And the other person's narrative is, no, we weren't perfect, but I think we never really gave it a try in therapy. Right. You had an affair with my best friend. I can never really forgive you.
Yeah.
And so maybe the Venn diagram is, we have reached a point in the marriage where we can no longer be married to each other. And the question is, what else goes in there?
Yes. What
do you do with the differences? And I think we can't go into all the details of that very important and complicated conversation today. But I guess we're both probably on the same page in saying, put as much in that central circle as you can.
Exactly.
In the beginning, it's always best not to portray yourselves as a villain and a martyr. We've talked about this a lot.
Yes.
It backfires in every way.
Yes.
So if you can find a narrative in which you are not using blame and recrimination as part of the narrative, but you can, you can't hide it. If you're sadder than your others,
Right.
the kids will pick that up and they're okay with that. But a very important part of the message really should be, we are supporting each other. Mm-hmm. If you cannot, really, really cannot come up with a shared narrative, then you're going to have separate conversations, and it's not the best, but it's better than inauthenticity. I think the really important part of a narrative is that you can say it, maybe not exactly in the same words or way as your co-parent, but that you can say it in as consistent a way between you as possible, but in a way you really believe. Yeah. Because if you don't believe it, if you can't get behind it, then you can't repeat it. And your kids will know.
And kids know. Yeah. Kids absolutely know. Yeah. Kate, number 3 here on the list, I really appreciate it because I don't think it gets a lot of air. It feels very practically obvious, but I haven't heard a lot about this. Mm-hmm. 3 being prepare other important adults in advance.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't get a lot of airtime. This issue of who should you tell in your child's universe that you're getting divorced rather than keeping it a family secret. I think, especially with young children, it's really a good idea to let their teachers, their coaches, any important adults in their lives know in advance that this change is happening in their family. Obviously, these have to be people you trust to keep your confidence. I think it's for a couple of reasons. One is part of what you want to communicate to your child is that they should feel free to share this information with anyone that they want to. And it's always helpful if people are prepared and don't react with shock or dismay. Yes. But also, especially with teachers, or people who spend significant time with your kids, you really want them to be part of your team, to be on the lookout for difficulties that your kids may have that are expressions of difficulty with the divorce that you might not see at home. There's a feedback loop. And in terms of telling grandparents and extended family, every family is different. You have to know who the cast of characters are and how they're likely to treat this information. Yes. If you have parents who are likely to run your ex down, then you may have to give them the information, but prepare your children to hear that. Not everyone is, does really well with this information, but let's assume that they're loving, caring, and trustworthy. Then you want them to kind of work out their own upset to some extent in advance so that they can be there for your kids. But you don't want them you don't want to tell anybody very far in advance because the risk of the information getting to your kids before you do. So unless you really, really trust them to keep your confidence for a period of time, I recommend like a day or two in advance of telling kids.
Okay, that's helpful. Our next tip, number 4, feels very important to me because this is something that obviously, we'll talk more about this, but has a great deal of importance, is going to be remembered always. So what you're saying here for number 4 is consider your timing and setting. Say more about that.
Right. Well, there's no good time to have this conversation, but there are definitely better and worse times. So if we think about it first in terms of a calendar, then we'll work our way down to like a time of day, right? Yeah. So if we think about a calendar, especially if you have kids of different ages, there can be some logistical problem. Like if you have a college age child and a high school age child, then there are only certain times during the year that your college age child is home. Right. And this is a conversation you want to have in person. Yeah. And so it's likely to be around a holiday. So parents worry.
It's tricky. Yeah.
I don't want to ruin Thanksgiving by having the conversation on is that always going to be
like not just this year, but every year. Right. What are we going to remember about Thanksgiving in the future?
Exactly. There's also the concern about, do we want to do it if it's the summer? Do we want to do it right when we're about to send them off back to school? Or whatever. So I think it's probably better to think in terms of, something aspirational. I think aspirationally, you want to have the talk at a time when all your children are together. It's not right up against their birthday or a holiday, if possible. And at a time when you and your co-parent are going to be available to them for at least a few days. Nobody has to travel. There's no major thing that needs doing. And, the kids are not, I'm not saying they can't have a soccer game that weekend,
right,
but that there isn't an extended family event or something. Certainly not where you're going to be out of town. Now, if we drill down a little bit and we say, well, when during the week, right? Assuming your kids are all in one place, the best you can do is a weekend, probably, or a long weekend. There, I recommend, often parents say, well, if you're telling me we should give them, a couple of days before they have to go back to school, so we'll do it Friday night. Maybe Friday night, but right before bedtime, especially if you have a young child, also not great.
Couldn't you make the argument that if a kid, for instance, has a soccer game, it's not the worst thing in the world to get the information, have a little time with it, but to go have their soccer game?
I think
life goes on.
No, I think you could make the argument that it's a good thing to then have a kind of normal social interaction. They don't have to go.
Right.
But most kids want to kind of to break up the intensity of the information.
Exactly.
It's the access to you part that's important. Saturday morning is sort of tends to be the sweet spot for a lot of people, unless it's teenagers who sleep till 1 and then it's Saturday afternoon.
Well, that leads it right into number 5, which is tell all your kids at the same time.
Yeah. So a lot of people feel like older children have an easier time with this information than younger, or they're facing the logistical problems that we mentioned earlier, where it's sometimes harder to track down your older kid. I think it's a disservice to a kid of any age, even an adult child, to give them information that they have to hold as a secret. So if you have a 16-year-old and a 4-year-old, I think they all still need to hear at the same time, even though you'll be right in thinking that they'll have different kinds of questions and they probably have different levels of at least conscious awareness of what's going on in the family. It's a family talk.
Yes.
It's only the beginning anyway. It's the beginning of a series of conversations that become more embroidered over time, take on more nuance, and you can have follow-up conversations with children individually.
We hope, yes.
One thing I didn't say when we were discussing tip number 4 about the timing, I think it's important to tell kids that you're going to split up before one of you moves out by about 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
And age does play a role here. Younger children probably need a little bit more time than older children, although I've seen the reverse be true. And there's no magic number, but the idea is that you don't precipitously start sleeping. One of you doesn't precipitously sort of disappear.
Okay, that makes a lot
and
of
also
sense.
Because many families want to give the kids the opportunity to see the second home, maybe spend a little time there before they do overnight. So a couple of weeks can be used in that way too.
And Kate, that brings up something that's so tricky that I hear all the time, Kate, which is those 2 weeks, if people are able to implement those 2 weeks before anybody moves out, can be the most hellish, let me say, difficult time when the parents are really in the phase where they're the most angry at each other or the most changes. How do we tolerate those 2 weeks while not making it hell for our kids?
I'm glad you brought that up. The first thing I want to say is that's just a guideline, the 1 or 2 to 3 week, just a guideline. And it does assume that the parents can be in the same house, and it might be difficult for them, but it's not intolerable for them. I also think it doesn't make a lot of sense for separating parents to continue to sleep in the same bedroom once they've told their kids that they're separating.
That seems confusing.
I think it is confusing. So it kind of means that if you don't have another bedroom or at least a couch in a separate room for you to sleep on, you probably ought to separate sooner than later. But also, if things are intolerable in the way you talk about, that it's just hellish for the parents, And there are different versions of hell. You know, there's the hell where I've been ready to leave forever and now I really can't stand it anymore. And then we may not be fighting, but I need out of here.
Yes.
Or there's the kind where, you know, it's a lot of fighting, or somebody's just in agony because they really don't want it's like a piano hanging over their head. Don't do that to yourselves. I mean, if you're really, really miserable, separate sooner. You know, maybe even right away, but make sure you're available to your kids, and probably, you know, in the marital home for some of the next week or two, if possible. You can do it, but maybe the other parent clears out when you come back, something like that.
Okay, Kate, didn't you also have a thought about? I mean, I'd be interested in hearing, where do you tell them?
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't know. Were you a Harry Potter? Did you ever read
Totally.
Yeah, okay. You know, the room of requirement. It shows up when you this sort of room
when you need it.
When you need it. If only we had a room of a place you could go where pain was suspended and all the words you needed were at the tip of your tongue. I think you should have the talk in a place in your own home, not in a public place. Sometimes people actually do it. You know, they do it in restaurants because they think it'll contain it somehow.
Right, and people will behave better.
People will behave better. Yeah, you do it in your family room, and, you know, where a place where your kids feel comfortable and can withdraw if they need to. That they can go and be by themselves at any point that they need to do that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so can you if you have to.
Yeah. Well, Kate, there's so much here. You know what I'm dying to hear about, of course, is what we're actually going to say to our kids.
Oh, that.
Right? What we're actually going to say. Just simply that. Now we know where, when, right? And about our plans, but what we're actually going to say. And because we have so much here, I think we've decided that we're going to put that in part 2.
So part 2.
Part 2, to be continued.
Okay.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, so we are ending part 1 of our episode, How to Tell Your Children About Your Divorce, doing well with the scariest conversation of your life, and we are going to pick up with part 2 in our next episode. So thanks again, Kate, and thanks to our listeners for listening to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Scharf's real-world advice for well-intentioned humans. And if you'd like to know right away when we have a new podcast or video, we invite you to follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or on Twitter at Divorce for Humans. That's Divorce, the number 4 Humans, and on YouTube at Divorce on Planet Earth. You can learn more about Kate and what we're writing and thinking about on her blog, divorceonplanetearth.com. If you have an idea for us for a future podcast, please write us at info@divorceonplanetearth.com. We hope that what you hear on this show will be helpful, but since everyone's situation is different, our content is not intended as a substitute for clinical advice or recommendations. I'm your co-host, Jane Prellinger. Your host has been Kate Scharf, and our producer is Eric Peguera. See you next time.